Rancher Elias Crowe threw open his cabin door at the first thunderous pound that shook the hinges, expecting a drunken ranch hand or a wolf driven mad by the Christmas blizzard, but instead a young woman in a torn, snow-soaked wedding dress pitched forward into his arms, her breath barely visible in the freezing night air, her hands scraped and trembling as she clutched a crumpled note pinned to her shawl with the desperate force of someone fighting death itself. Elias lifted her quickly, shocked by how light she was, how cold her skin felt through the shredded lace, and when he carried her inside and laid her near the fire, he finally peeled the wet paper from her chest. 3 words written with shaking ink. Protect her. Please. The woman tried to sit up, gasping as pain jolted through her side, one hand flying to her belly where the unmistakable curve of late pregnancy rose beneath the ruined dress, and Elias's breath locked in his throat as he whispered, "Who did this to you?" But she shook her head violently, a terrified sob catching in her throat as if even speaking his name could summon him from the storm outside. She gripped Elias's wrist with surprising strength, her fingers ice cold, eyes wild, silently begging him not to turn her away. He wrapped her in blankets, trying to warm her trembling limbs, but as he pushed damp curls from her face, he saw the shadows of fresh bruises along her jaw, rope burns circling her wrists, and deep nail marks on her arms, as if someone had dragged her across rough ground in a desperate struggle she barely escaped. "Your wedding dress," he murmured, noticing the ripped veil tangled in her hair. Someone tore it. She flinched so hard her entire body seized, and when Elias asked if her husband had done this, she shook her head with frantic terror, tears welling as she whispered a single fractured word, "Hiding," and pressed the note back into his chest as if his understanding meant the difference between life and death. Before he could ask more, a sound cut through the storm outside, a long, low cry that wasn't wind or wolf, but a man's voice echoing through the snow-covered trees, calling her name with a chilling familiarity that made her collapse against Elias in panic. He grabbed his rifle instinctively and stepped in front of her, shielding her from the door as boards rattled under another violent strike of wind. "He found us," she whispered, hand trembling over her unborn child. "Please, don't let him take me back." And as the cry came again, closer this time, filled with rage and possession, Elias realized no one left this woman on his doorstep expecting kindness. They had left her here because he could fight, and because someone out in that storm was willing to kill to reclaim her. Elias Crowe stood with his rifle raised as the blizzard slammed against the cabin, the Christmas wind howling like a wild beast, but nothing chilled him as deeply as the panicked way the young bride, half-frozen, bruised, gasping, pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into the logs the moment that voice outside called her name again. A slow, dragging sound that carried ownership instead of affection. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders with trembling fingers, whispering, "He found me. I didn't think he'd come so fast." And Elias kept his stance firm, despite the ice crawling up his spine, because a man didn't chase a woman through a storm like this unless obsession, or something darker, drove him. "Who is he?" Elias demanded. But she shook her head, breath breaking as she whispered, "The one I escaped from." And another hard knock slammed the door, not frantic but controlled, the knock of a man confident he'd catch what he was hunting. Elias stepped closer to her, trying to shield her with his frame, but she slid down the wall, gripping her stomach as a sharp pain shot through her, tightening her entire body. "You're close to delivering," Elias muttered, and she nodded with wide, terrified eyes, whispering, "He said the child was his right, that Christmas Eve was symbolic, that he'd come for me before midnight." Elias's jaw locked with anger. "Did he write this note?" She shook her head and pointed weakly toward the window. Someone helped me escape. Someone inside his house. They pinned it to me and pushed me into the snow. I don't even know if they survived." Elias felt something fierce rise in him. Anger, protectiveness, instinct. But before he could speak, the shadow under the door shifted. Slow. Heavy. Purposeful. The man outside inhaled, the sound soft but chilling. "I know she's in there," he called, voice smooth and eerily calm. "Open the door, rancher. This isn't your concern." Elias moved silently to the window, keeping to the shadows. Through the frost-glazed glass, he glimpsed a tall figure cloaked in snow, hair plastered to his face, shoulders broad, posture steady, too steady for a man battling a blizzard, and beside him, half buried in snow, lay a horse slumped to its knees, exhausted or dead, proving just how far and hard he'd ridden to reclaim what he believed was his. "He won't stop," the bride whispered, curling protectively over her belly. "He said a bride doesn't leave, even if she never wanted the vow." Another strike hit the door, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Elias pressured her gently. "Your name. Tell me your name." "Lydia," she whispered. "Lydia Marsh." Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. "Lydia, no one takes a woman from my doorstep. Not tonight, not ever." Outside, the man's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "Elias Crowe, open this door." And the rancher realized the stranger didn't just know Lydia. He knew him too. Elias Crowe froze. Not because Lydia clutched his coat with white-knuckled terror, not because the cabin shook with the weight of another slow, confident strike against the door, but because the man outside had spoken his name with the easy familiarity of someone who had been waiting for this moment, someone who had studied him, someone who had ridden through a Christmas blizzard with purpose carved into his bones. Lydia's breath hitched as Elias instinctively stepped between her and the door, the rifle raised, his pulse pounding in his ears. She whispered, "He knows you. How does he know you?" But Elias didn't answer, because a memory flickered in the back of his mind. An auction last spring, a rancher selling off his stock, a stranger watching Elias with eyes too dark, too still. Yet he shoved the thought away, focusing instead on the trembling woman behind him. "Stay low," he ordered, voice low and steady. Another knock, 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 landed with the same rhythm as a hammer striking a coffin lid. Then the man spoke again, tone calm enough to scrape Elias's nerves raw. "Elias, open the door. She's mine. She was promised. You don't want trouble with her kin." Elias's grip tightened. The man's voice wasn't slurred, wasn't frantic. This was a man fully in control, a man sure of his claim, a man who believed the world owed him obedience. Lydia pressed her hand to her belly, wincing as a contraction rippled through her. "Please, don't open it. He's not family, he's not husband. He's something else." "What is he?" Elias demanded. Lydia shook her head, hair sticking to her sweaty forehead. "He called himself my guardian when my parents died. But he never guarded, he watched. He waited. He kept me like a locked thing, and when I grew older he talked about vows, about how a woman on Christmas Eve belonged to whichever man had the right blood. I ran the night he took the dress off the wall, and said the ceremony wouldn't wait till spring." Rage burned low in Elias's gut. Outside, footsteps crunched softly through snow, too soft for a normal walk, too controlled. The man wasn't pacing, he was positioning. Elias edged toward the frost-clouded window and wiped a small circle clear with the back of his glove. The stranger stood not 3 feet away, head slightly tilted, as if sensing the exact spot Elias was watching from. His pale eyes glowed in the moonlit storm, unsettlingly calm. He lifted a small, carved wooden ornament, the kind placed on graves, and pressed it gently against Elias's window. A twisted Christmas symbol, a warning, A claim. Elias felt Lydia shiver violently behind him. "He puts those on anyone he thinks he owns?" she whispered. "My husband. He tried to stop him once." Elias stiffened. "Your husband?" Lydia's voice broke. "He didn't survive." Outside, the stranger smiled faintly at the window, as if hearing her through the glass. "Elias," he murmured, "I won't ask again." And the storm quieted just enough for the rancher to realize the truth. This wasn't a man searching for Lydia. This was a man who had been hunting her for years. Elias Crowe didn't lower the rifle for even a heartbeat. As the stranger's pale eyes stared through the frost-glazed window, the carved grave ornament still pressed against the glass like a twisted Christmas claim, and Lydia clutched Elias's sleeve with such panic that her nails dug through wool and into his skin while she whispered, "Don't let him take me. He'll drag me back. He'll hurt the baby." But even as another contraction seized her body, bending her forward with a trembling gasp, she forced herself to remain upright because she knew the man outside fed on fear, savored it, hunted it, and Elias stepped in front of her instinctively, broad shoulders blocking her view as the stranger tapped the glass once with the ornament. A soft, methodical click that felt like a death knell. Then the stranger's voice slid under the door, smooth and controlled. "Elias, she belongs to my blood. Hand her over. She was promised. And what's inside her is mine to raise." And Lydia whimpered in pure terror, clutching her belly as if shielding the unborn child from a ghost that had never stopped stalking her, her voice cracking as she whispered, "He lies. My husband tried to protect me. He died because this man claims every life connected to his bloodline." And Elias felt fury coil through him, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. So he stepped closer to the window, staring directly into the stranger's emotionless gaze as he shouted, "You have no right here!" But instead of rage, the stranger smiled faintly, tilting his head as though Elias were a stubborn animal that needed breaking. Lydia gripped Elias's coat more tightly. "He'll circle now," she whispered shakily. "He checks every weakness, every window, every board." And then came the faint sound, barely there, of snow crunching around the side of the cabin, slow, steady, predatory footsteps tracing the walls with the same patience a wolf used when cornering prey. Elias's pulse hammered as he followed the sound, rifle swinging to the left window just as a shadow flickered past, too tall, too still, too deliberate, and Lydia's whispered, "He knows this place. He watched us during the harvest last year. He said I'd make a good winter bride," sent a shiver down Elias's spine. The man outside spoke again, voice drifting like smoke. "Elias Crowe, you don't understand what you've invited into your home?" And then the doorknob twitched gently, as if tested by someone confident it would eventually give way, causing Lydia to choke on a sob as she slid down the wall, curling around her belly, whispering fractured prayers, while Elias cocked the rifle and growled, "Try the door, and you'll meet lead," to which the stranger only laughed softly, a chilling sound swallowed by the storm. Silence fell. Dangerous, calculating silence, and though the footsteps faded, Lydia whispered the truth Elias already knew. The man wasn't leaving. He was circling. He was hunting. And he had no intention of letting Christmas morning arrive without reclaiming what he believed was his. The storm battered the cabin walls with a fury that made even the window panes tremble, but inside, the sudden silence was so unnatural it stopped Elias's breath mid-chest, and Lydia felt it too, her body curling with the next brutal contraction as she clutched the blanket around her shoulders, fear thick in her eyes as she whispered, "When it goes quiet, he's climbing." And Elias instantly moved to the center of the room, rifle angled upward, scanning the rafters as dust drifted from the ceiling in thin, trembling trails. He whispered, "How do you know?" But Lydia's voice cracked as she answered. Because he always climbed above me when he was angry. He wanted to look down on me. Wanted me to know he watched every breath. And Elias felt something raw and protective surge through him as another soft scrape drifted across the roof. Heavy, deliberate, as though the storm itself parted around the man crawling across the timber, and Lydia pressed a hand to her belly, gasping as her child kicked hard, sensing danger too. Elias moved with steady steps toward the fireplace, eyes locked on the ceiling as he whispered, "How long has he hunted you?" And Lydia sobbed, "My parents died when I was 12. He became my guardian and said I was born to fulfill a Christmas vow. He kept me like a locked thing until my husband tried to free me." And Elias clenched his jaw so hard it ached because he could hear the stranger testing the beams now. Slow pressure shifting wood fibers until a deep crack split through the loft, sending splinters drifting downward like falling snow. Lydia screamed as a boot punched through the timber. Then a hand, long-fingered, pale, cold, curled around the beam with predator-like certainty as the stranger lowered himself inch by inch through the ceiling, his face emerging from the shadows, expression unnervingly calm, eyes glowing with possession as he whispered, "Lydia, you left your vow unfinished." Elias fired a warning shot into the rafters, the explosion shaking dust loose in a choking cloud, forcing the stranger to jerk back. But he didn't fall. He clung to the wood with an animal grip, retreating only a foot before repositioning like a spider sensing its prey beneath. Lydia sobbed harder, breath breaking with pain and terror, her contraction forcing her to her knees as she begged, "Elias, he won't stop. He'll come again. He always comes again." And Elias gritted his teeth, pulling her close with one arm, while keeping the rifle trained on the ceiling as the stranger whispered from above, his voice dripping onto the room like poison. "You can't keep her from me. Christmas vows bind deeper than blood." And Elias realized with grim certainty that the nightmare had only begun, and he would have to face a man who believed the night itself belonged to him. Elias barely had time to drag Lydia away from the falling dust before another heavy thud hit the rafters, the stranger shifting his weight like a predator, testing every beam for a weakness, and Lydia clung to Elias's arm with a strength born from terror as she whispered, "He's angry now. He only climbs when he thinks someone stole what's his." And Elias felt his pulse hammer in his throat as he moved her behind the large wooden table, shielding her with his body while the fire crackled with an eerie hiss, as if warning them the storm was no longer the only danger outside. Another contraction tore through Lydia, her body folding forward with a breathless cry, but she clamped a hand over her mouth to stay silent because any sound, even her pain, might draw the stranger down through the ceiling faster. Elias grabbed his rifle tighter, whispering, "Stay low, don't move, don't make a sound." But his words were drowned out by the sharp crack of a board splitting above them, followed by a shower of splinters as the stranger drove his heel through the timber with terrifying precision, each strike measured, patient, and merciless, as though he were breaking into a livestock pen. Elias raised the rifle and aimed at the widening gap, but the stranger's voice oozed through the darkness above them before his face appeared, cold and smooth and hungry. "You hide her like she's yours, Elias Crowe," he murmured, "but you don't understand the vow she carries." Lydia let out a strangled sob, her body shaking as she pressed herself against the wall. "He killed my husband," she whispered through clenched teeth. "He said if my husband loved me, he didn't deserve me." The stranger's hand gripped the beam harder at that, and Elias saw the truth in his eyes. He enjoyed this. The fear, the chase, the idea that Lydia had no future without him threading through it. Another board cracked, and the stranger began lowering himself again, his boots searching for the next foothold. But Elias fired a second shot, the bullet exploding inches from the man's leg and showering the loft with dust. The stranger didn't fall. He retreated just enough to avoid the blast, breathing hard, almost laughing. "Guns won't keep her," he whispered. "I chose her Christmas Eve. That makes her mine." Elias grabbed Lydia and pulled her farther into the corner, her body trembling uncontrollably as another contraction hit her, stronger than the last, her breath shredding into the cold air. "Elias," she gasped, "he won't leave. Not until I'm dead or taken." Above them, the stranger shifted again, crawling along the beams toward the opposite corner of the loft, searching, planning, patient. Elias could hear him dragging something heavy, something metal, and Lydia's eyes widened in horror as she whispered, "He's prying the ceiling boards loose. He's breaking his way in." And Elias realized they were running out of time, because the man above them wouldn't wait for dawn, or mercy, or reason. He wanted Lydia before Christmas morning, and nothing on earth frightened him enough to stop. Elias barely managed to drag Lydia farther into the corner before the ceiling groaned again, the stranger shifting his weight slowly, methodically, as though savoring each inch of progress, each crack in the timber, each tremble in Lydia's breath, as she fought both terror and the tightening waves of labor tearing through her body. The fire flickered wildly, shadows leaping up the walls like warnings, and Elias pressed his free hand against Lydia's back, whispering, "Stay with me. Stay strong," while keeping the rifle pointed toward the shifting darkness above them, his finger trembling not from fear, but from the fury boiling inside him at the thought of this man dragging a pregnant bride back into whatever nightmare she had escaped. Then came a sharp metal clang, once, twice, followed by the unmistakable sound of a crowbar digging into wood, prying, ripping, pulling boards loose with terrifying patience. Lydia gasped, covering her mouth with both hands, tears spilling as she whispered, "He used that same tool on the door of my husband's room, the night he died." And Elias felt the sickness in his stomach turn to a hot, protective rage as splinters rained down through the widening gap, the stranger's pale fingers curling around the edge like a creature from a nightmare, finally reaching its prey. "You ran far, Lydia," the man called softly, his voice slipping through the rafters like poisoned honey. "But Christmas vows cannot be broken. Not by you, not by him, not by the rancher who thinks he can hide you." Elias shouted back, "You'll die before you touch her." But the stranger laughed, a cold, breathy chuckle that made Lydia's shoulders shake uncontrollably. "Good men have tried," he murmured. "All of them failed." The crowbar jammed again, harder this time, and a large board split free, crashing to the floor inches from Elias's boots, letting in a blast of cold air and a clear view of the stranger crouched in the loft, his face half-shadowed, half-illuminated by moonlight, his eyes shining with predatory devotion. Another contraction hit Lydia so hard she collapsed onto her side, with a cry she couldn't bite back, and the stranger's head snapped toward the sound, hunger igniting in his expression. "She's close," he whispered. "Good. The child should be born under my protection." Elias fired again, the shot blasting through the edge of the opening, missing the stranger's shoulder by a breath. But this time the man reacted. He retreated only long enough to reposition, then slammed the crowbar into another beam, ripping another board free with terrifying strength. Snow swirled from the loft as a second opening appeared, and the stranger's boot lowered toward it, searching for a foothold. Lydia clutched Elias's sleeve, voice shaking violently. "He's coming through! Elias, he's coming through!" And Elias tightened his grip on the rifle as he realized the truth. This wasn't a siege anymore. This was the moment the hunter finally decided to enter the cabin and claim what he believed was his. Elias didn't even get a chance to reposition before the stranger dropped his full weight onto the second opening he'd torn into the ceiling, the wood groaning under the impact as snow and splinters showered the room like a violent blizzard of their own. and Lydia screamed as she tried to sit up. Another brutal contraction ripping through her body so hard her hands curled into claws against the floor. Elias lunged toward her, dragging her toward the far wall, while keeping the rifle leveled at the widening gap above them. But the stranger moved with unnatural precision, lowering himself slowly, deliberately, his boots searching for purchase as if he had climbed into countless locked places before this one. "She's mine, Elias Crowe," the man hissed, pale fingers curling around the beam as his head dipped through the hole, moonlit eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. "You can't protect what was promised by blood." Lydia choked on a sob, shaking violently as she clutched her belly, whispering, "Elias, please, please don't let him near me. He'll take the baby. He'll take everything." And her terror only fueled Elias's anger as he stepped in front of her, shoulders squared, rifle raised, ready to shoot the moment the stranger's foot touched the floor. The man didn't hurry. He lowered himself with eerie calm, speaking as he descended. "A bride chosen on Christmas Eve belongs to the guardian who claims her fate. I raised her, fed her, prepared her, and her child. My brother's blood rightfully belongs to our line." Elias spat. "She doesn't belong to anyone." But the stranger's smile widened, revealing a cold devotion that made Lydia shrink back, trembling so hard the blanket slipped from her shoulders. "Lydia," he murmured, "you should never have run. This labor wouldn't hurt so much if you were where you belong." Elias fired another warning shot so close, the stranger's braid jerked from the force of the bullet's heat. But instead of falling, the man dropped the final distance in one fluid motion, landing on the table with a solid thud that rattled every cup and pot, then stepping off it with eerie calm onto the cabin floor. "Guns won't save you," he whispered, eyes locked on Lydia as if Elias didn't exist. "You're marked. You always have been." Lydia sobbed, crawling backward until she hit the wall, both hands clamped over her belly as another contraction tore through her, her voice strangled and panicked as she cried, "He killed my husband, Elias. He killed him because he wouldn't hand me over. He'll kill you too." The stranger took one more step toward her, and Elias pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded through the cabin so violently that Lydia screamed and clutched her belly as the baby lurched inside her, and Elias staggered backward from the recoil, smoke curling from the barrel as the bullet slammed straight into the stranger's shoulder. But the man barely faltered. He jerked to the side with a grunt, but instead of falling he straightened slowly, his pale eyes burning with something far worse than rage, certainty, devotion, obsession that had long crossed into madness. "You can't kill what's claimed by vow," he hissed, gripping the bleeding wound with his free hand as he took another step toward Lydia, whose terrified gasps filled the cabin as another contraction seized her body folding forward, sweat mixing with tears. Elias pumped another round, but the stranger lunged faster than Elias expected, knocking the rifle aside with a brutal sweep of his arm, the gun skidding across the floor beneath the table as the stranger snarled, "You think you can take her from me? You think you can steal what's mine under the Christmas moon?" Lydia crawled backward, trembling so violently she could barely breathe, her fingers clawing the wooden floor as she begged, "Elias, Elias, don't let him! Please!" But the stranger reached her first, his hand snatching a fistful of her torn wedding dress, hauling her upward as she screamed in agony. Elias swung at him with pure instinct, tackling him sideways, ripping Lydia from his grasp, and shoving her behind him as the two men crashed into the shelves by the hearth, jars shattering, sparks bursting from the disturbed firewood. The stranger recovered instantly, moving with unnatural speed as he slammed Elias against the wall, fingers digging into his throat with crushing force. Elias clawed at his wrist, vision blurring as the stranger whispered, "You were never meant to touch her," his breath cold and controlled despite the blood dripping from his shoulder. Lydia, shaking and half delirious from pain, crawled toward the fallen rifle, each movement a battle, her breath breaking as she whispered, "Elias, hold on. Please." But the stranger saw her reach for the weapon and threw Elias aside like a rag doll, lunging toward her just as she wrapped trembling fingers around the stock. Lydia screamed as he seized her wrist, twisting it cruelly, and Elias roared in fury, launching himself forward despite the burning pain in his ribs, slamming into the stranger's back with enough force to knock them both onto the floor in a tangle of limbs. The rifle clattered from Lydia's grasp, sliding under the table again as she sobbed, "Stop! Stop! Stop, please!" But the stranger only snarled, "You're coming with me, now!" He struck Elias across the jaw with the butt of the crowbar he'd dropped earlier, sending him crashing into the wall, dazed and bleeding, and Lydia shrieked as the man grabbed her again, dragging her across the floor while she kicked and fought through contractions so powerful she could barely stay conscious. And as she screamed Elias's name, her voice cracking with terror, the rancher forced himself onto his elbows, vision swimming, determination hardening through the pain. He would not let this monster take her, not while he still had breath in his body. Elias forced himself up despite the ringing in his skull and the blood trickling from his brow, the world tilting dangerously as the stranger dragged Lydia across the cabin floor toward the open doorway he'd kicked in moments earlier, snow whipping into the room like shards of ice. And Lydia screamed through another brutal contraction, her fingernails scraping the wood as she fought to anchor herself, her voice breaking as she cried, "Elias, please, don't let him take my baby, don't let him take me!" While the stranger hissed, "You should never have run, Lydia. You were promised, you were chosen, you carry a legacy owed to my blood." And he wrenched her upward with a grip so tight she gasped in pain, her belly tightening again as she nearly collapsed. Elias lunged forward on instinct, but the stranger kicked him hard in the ribs, sending him sliding into the hearth where sparks burst up in a shower, singeing his shirt and filling the room with the sharp scent of burning wool. Lydia cried out his name again, the plea so desperate it snapped something inside him, flooding his limbs with strength he didn't know he still had. The stranger dragged her into the doorway, snow swirling around them like a violent halo, and Lydia clung to the jamb long enough to slow him, her voice cracking into a sob as she screamed, "He killed my husband! He'll kill me! He'll kill the child! Elias, please!" And that final plea tore Elias from the ground with a roar, his body moving before the pain could stop him as he hurled himself at the stranger from behind, tackling him into the porch rail with such force that the wood splintered beneath them both. The stranger snarled, twisting with feral strength, the crowbar swinging down, but Elias caught his wrist mid-strike, teeth gritted, muscles trembling, and slammed the man's hand against the rail until the crowbar dropped into the snow. Lydia collapsed in the doorway, sobbing and clutching her belly, her water breaking in a gush that froze instantly against the cold boards, and the stranger's eyes flicked toward her with a terrifying hunger, as if the sight of her in labor fueled him. "She's mine," he rasped. "She was always mine." "Not anymore," Elias growled, and with the last of his strength, he shoved the stranger backward just as the porch rail gave way. The man's eyes widened as the broken wood snapped under his boots, and he tumbled sideways down the icy embankment, slipping, sliding, crashing into the drift below. Elias didn't wait. He leapt after him, landing hard in the snow, grabbing the stranger's coat before he could rise, and slammed his fist into the man's jaw, then again, then a third time, each blow fueled by Lydia's screams echoing from the cabin. The stranger finally went limp, unconscious or worse, snow swallowing his body as the blizzard thickened around them. Elias dragged himself back up the embankment, lungs burning, limbs shaking, and crawled toward Lydia, who was crying out in agony as another contraction seized her. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her gently, whispering, I've got you. He'll never touch you again. I swear it," carrying her inside away from the storm, away from the nightmare, away from the broken vow that nearly consumed her. And as Lydia clung to him, shaking and sobbing and beginning to bring her child into the world, Elias Crowe understood the truth. He hadn't just protected her. He had saved her life. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,